So we had a very interesting announcement today, that being a new piece of hardware coming from Valve. It is actually a handheld PC device that will allow you to play your Steam games on the go. And we had heard of this several months ago with reports that were coming out saying Valve was going to try to get this thing out this year. Pricing and even specs were the biggest questions around this device. And I have to give Valve a lot of credit. What they have presented here is very impressive, and we're going to talk about it here today, guys. If you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton, and if you're new here to the SpawnWave Plus channel, make sure you subscribe down below. Now, first thing, I'm going to have this as part of Newswave tomorrow, going over more of the information around, like pricing and details and what comes with each bundle and all of that. More of an overview. What I wanted to do here was go through kind of the specs that they have included here with this device and kind of get more into some of the smaller details. As I was going through it, I realized it would take up like a good chunk of Newswave overall, so I figured we'd break it off here onto the SpawnWave Plus channel. So let's head over here. This is the Steam Deck website, and they have a lot of information on this site because there really is a lot going on here with this new device. I mean, just from the front of it here, you could see stuff is all over the place. There are two touchpads. We have two analog sticks, the full array of buttons, and a D-pad as you expect. They're up a little high, and I'm curious as to how this thing actually feels in the hands. But even beyond that, we do have triggers, of course, on the back here, as well as grip buttons or macro buttons going all the way up to L5 and R5. If you remember, this is going to be playing PC games, so there's going to be a need for a lot of different buttons for some of these games. Now, if we go over to the tech specs, they were nice enough to show us a pretty good layout from different angles of this system. First things first, it's a pretty big system. There's a video of them holding it up, and yeah, it's not exactly pocket size is what I'll say, but you could argue that the Switch itself isn't necessarily pocket sized. You would want a case for it, and this one will come with a case, as Valve pretty much understands this is something you're going to be more or less putting in a backpack or just kind of holding and carrying around. But we can see the front here, again, with a pretty good layout, dual speakers, dual microphones, by the way. So I guess we'll have one maybe that is dedicated to hearing the background noise and maybe trying to get rid of it. That's going to be interesting to see how that turns out. A 7-inch touchscreen, though. Now, the touchscreen itself is 1280 by 800. I saw some people disappointed by that. You know what? I think Valve also ran plenty of tests and focus groups and all of this and realized people aren't seeing a massive difference when you put it in front of them between, say, 720p and 1080p, and they decided to go with a 16 by 10 aspect ratio, giving them a 1280 by 800p resolution, which also in handheld mode, if there's not a very big discernible difference between that and 1080p, well, you might as well take the frame rate or the added frame boost that you get from that of going down in resolution. So there you go. They do have a Steam button that's dedicated to it as well, and we also have a quick access button. The D-pad and the A, B, X, and Y buttons are going to be weird. That's something I have to hold to see how that actually feels, because they are in like the top corners of this system. So people say it's comfortable. Those who have had hands-on, like IGN, for example, I don't know. When I get that, we'll see. And on top, we do have R2, R1, L2, L1 volume, buttons up here, headphone jack. We have a vent here for our fan, and then we have another vent, I believe, on the back here for the fan. So it's going to be pulling air in through the back here and then kind of jetting it out of the top. It is running through a USB Type-C port at the top here, a status LED, and then a power button. I think it looks thin enough. Like I said, the biggest part here is obviously they decided to spread it out so it doesn't look like a big brick that you'd hold. So we do have some, obviously, some added width here, or thickness to it, just from kind of having to jut out to accommodate the L2 and the R2 triggers there. And then we have a micro SD slot down here. So if you do get the 64 gigabyte model, you will have expandable storage option there. You can just drop in a 512 gigabyte SD card and you'll be off and running. And then we have our back buttons here. Now, moving down to the actual specs that they have included, and they went pretty in depth here, which is great. We do have an AMD APU. The CPU is a Zen 2, 4 cores, 8 threads, 2.4 gigahertz up to 3.5 gigahertz boosted, 448 gigaflops at floating point 32. So like the CPU is all right. I mean, it should be pretty solid. I don't think it's going to be a massive bottleneck or anything for the GPU itself, but obviously the thing that they are really pushing right now is the GPU, as this is mostly being set up to run games. Like that's their biggest thing. They want this to be able to run AAA style games that are graphically demanding, but you can play them on the go off the battery. And this is the part that I'm very excited for, the GPU. We have 8 RDNA 2 compute units, ranging from 1 gigahertz up to 1.6, up to 1.6 teraflops at floating point 32, which means this is like right there with a base PlayStation 4. Now, the base PlayStation 4, like raw power is 1.84 teraflops, I think. But remember, that is older technology from AMD. It's back a couple of generations now. So even though this technically has 1.6 teraflops, would be less in terms of brute power, brute force, it's most likely going to have a much bigger feature set and be able to do things that PS4 won't be able to. So that's kind of why I'm putting it right there with the base PS4, which, by the way, super impressive that in 8 years, we're going to have basically a portable PlayStation 4 device. Now, the biggest thing here that I do have to stress is because this is not going to be a closed box system, meaning it's going to be running their SteamOS, which I believe is based on a Linux kernel, but you can also run Windows on it, as they did talk about being able to sideload your own OS. It's not going to have games specifically designed for the CPU or the GPU or any of that, which is something that like the PS5, the Xbox Series, and even the Switch can benefit from. So I think this should be able to run AAA games well enough, especially at that 800p resolution. But it's still not going to be able to really act like a system that has the ability to be developed specifically for. But if we go down here to the RAM, 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM. And a device like this would need more RAM anyway, because it will also be running a heavier OS on top of playing the games. But the fact that we have 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM, which is a generation up from what's in the Switch right now, that's very impressive, especially when you look at the pricing. Now, most of the pricing tiers come down to the storage. 64 gigabytes of eMMC memory is what is slotted for that $399 model. And to be completely honest, I feel like if you're really going to dive into this device and make that investment, I think it's worth at least going up to the 256 gigabyte model using NVMe SSD. If you can really swing it, the 512 gigabyte high-speed NVMe SSD is probably the best way to go about it. But I think if you're just trying to figure out, okay, what's the best one I can get for bang for my buck and all of that, the 256 gigabyte model is probably the one to go with, especially using PCIe Gen 3. But looking at the specs here, just with the CPU, GPU, the RAM, I mean, it just runs over the Switch. Like, it's not even close when it comes to just specs and raw power. And the reason I'm very excited for this is because while I don't think this is going to be as broad of a market as the Switch is, it's still something that competes more than if it's like a GPD win, as an example, because Valve is a large company that can back something like this and put it in front of a lot of people and market it like that. So I'm looking at this thinking, okay, this is better competition for what we've seen from NVIDIA with their X1, which already was starting to look old. Now we see this. It looks ancient now, so like I don't think NVIDIA's response to this from AMD with this kind of an APU with their Zen 2 and RDNA set up here and just go, well, that's it. We can't compete with what AMD's doing here. No. This is when NVIDIA goes, all right, watch this. And they have their own chip to compete. Like I said, competition is good. People have been wondering about Nintendo and NVIDIA if they can come up with their own kind of chipset that can bring things to the next level for the Switch family of devices. Seeing AMD do this, yeah, I think NVIDIA can at least have a comparable chip to this. The screen resolution, 1280 by 800, we just talked about that before, but it will be a touch screen, 7 inches inside, diagonal to diagonal, 400 nits. That's about standard. 60 hertz, again, touch enabled, and it will have an ambient light sensor. Connectivity is Bluetooth 5, and then the Wi-Fi's pretty standard up to AC. Audio is just stereo speakers, which we could see on the front of it. Dual microphone array, 3.5 millimeter stereo headphone jack. We get down to the power itself. So the biggest takeaway here is that it will have 2 to 8 hours of gameplay, and that's just where we are with battery technology. I mean, I know people will look at this Switch and be like, the battery's not great on it. Well, the battery's not going to be great on this either, all right? Because we're playing games that will require quite a bit of juice to run, and if you get some of those more intensive games, yeah, you're probably going to be closer to this 2-hour mark. If you're playing like smaller indie titles that maybe aren't as graphically intensive, you could get maybe on the other side of things closer to this 8-hour mark. I wouldn't expect this thing to run Doom Eternal or Control for any serious length of time. Those are going to be games that are like 2 to 3 hours. Now, they do go over display out options with USB-C that has DisplayPort 1.4 with up to 8K at 60 Hz, 4K at 120 Hz, USB 3.2 Gen 2, and they have it as an approximate weight of 669 grams. That's not a light system, but we just went over all the technology in this thing, and it doesn't have like removable Joy-Cons or any of that. So it's going to be a heavier device for the most part, running Steam OS 3.0, but they did mention that you will be able to sideload your own OS. Now, they do also show the dock here, which it looks like they tried to pack a lot in because they even turned the USB 3.1 port sideways to make all of this work, but it does have that Ethernet LAN part. They might want to put some marketing around that, like Nintendo did with their dock. But HDMI 2.0, DisplayPort 1.4, so I guess we'll have multiple outputs to different monitors there if you would like, which is really cool. Ton of connectivity on here. It looks like the power in's just USB Type-C. So, wow, overall, I have to say, for $300 to start out here, and then yes, it works up to like $600 some odd dollars, but just having that entry pricing at $399 with the amount of features and the technical specifications here with a newer Zen 2 chipset and all this, it's very impressive that Valve and AMD were able to get together and do this. And I welcome all the competition we can get into the handheld device sector because Sony's not doing anything with that. Microsoft doesn't seem interested outside of just streaming its devices already exist. So, hey, hats off to Valve, looking to see if NVIDIA has any kind of answer on a consumer level product to this chip here. And then, of course, that'd be something they partner with Nintendo for, I guess, the Switch Pro. Well, here you go. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Switch Pro. Valve had to be the one to do it. But let me know what you guys think about this device, the Steam Deck, coming out in December. I'll have more of an overview of it tomorrow in Newswave pricing, all of this. But thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.